There's no film as unapologetically indescribable as House. Known for its insane plot and an even more surreal editing style, it's a cult classic that has captivated audiences with its blend of horror, humor, and absurdity for nearly 50 years. If you've seen the film, I'm sure you'd agree with comparing watching House to stepping inside a child's fever dream, which makes sense, considering the director, Nobuhiko Obayashi, consulted with his 11-year-old daughter while writing it.
なぜかというと、大人は自分が分かることしか考えないから人間のレベルだからつまらない。子供はね、分からないことと向き合うのね。
House follows a girl named Gorgeous as she and a group of her friends travel to the Japanese countryside in hopes of spending a nice vacation in her widowed aunt's enormous house. Unfortunately, before the sun sets on the first day, one of the girls disappears under mysterious circumstances, and by sunrise the next morning, each member of the friend group will meet their demise under circumstances as bizarre as the last. It's incredibly easy to laugh at House's nonsense. In fact, I'd argue this is encouraged by the director. It's labeled a horror comedy. But there's a lot more to the story than meets the eye. House's narrative isn't contained to this one haunting night in the middle of nowhere. If you want to understand the full story, you'd have to go back 37 years before the film was released, on September 22nd, 1940, when Japan formally entered the Second World War. Nobuhiko Obayashi was just 7 years old when the US dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. As a native of the prefecture, he lost all of his friends in an incomprehensible act of violence that shattered the innocence of his childhood, a loss shared by many others.
When American bombers swept down like a bolt from the blue to their surprise attack.
Obayashi's passion for filmmaking began around this time, and as his career evolved from independent projects to commercial films, the echoes of World War II can be seen throughout much of his work. House is no exception. In the film, before the girls arrive at Auntie's house, they learn the story of her fiancé who never returned from war through this meta film sequence that Gorgeous and her friends watch with us. Auntie's potential future as part of a happy, traditional family was stolen from her as she waited endlessly for her fiancé's return, a wait that, as we later discover, continued even after her death. Much like Obayashi's own experience with World War II, Auntie's story illustrates how the trauma of war robbed her of her youth. The girls are perfectly empathetic about Auntie's loss, but one aspect of the sequence is nothing short of a gut punch. No matter how knowledgeable they are about the war, the fact of the matter is that Gorgeous and her friends, thankfully, didn't live through it. They don't fully understand the detrimental effects of the war or why comparing a nuclear bomb to cotton candy is more than a little tasteless. There's something about that innocence that's so desirable and frustrating all in one. As a reminder, House was released in the late 70s, so I'm sure Japanese elders had trouble navigating their relationship with younger generations. In this period, it seemed like the generational divide was as intense as it could be, and Obayashi had the unique experience of seeing this relationship between himself and his daughter. As far as I can tell, Obayashi approached this relationship with understanding, not envy. Auntie, however, embodies the perpetuating cycle of generational trauma. She wastes no time to lure the girls into her trap, getting rid of the ones who can't help her achieve her goal of reliving her youth and possessing the one who can. Had her fiancé not died in the war, Auntie wouldn't have gone into the business of killing the young girls she envied. Over 30 years after the war ended, Auntie goes out of her way to make sure the innocent youth feel its effects. Granted, generational trauma doesn't typically result in death, although it can, but it absolutely does result in hurting children who don't deserve it. Every single time. As if the theme of generational trauma wasn't strong enough, Auntie's cat, who leads the girls to her house, is nefariousness incarnate. Her eyes light up just before something bad happens, much like something we've seen before. Blanche, the cat, serves as a message that generational trauma is relentless, constantly looming over or under all that are impacted by it. In the world of House, there are two types of women, the lonely spinster and the perfect bride. Gorgeous' stepmom is an absurdly exaggerated representation of the latter archetype. She's beautiful, kind, and graceful, dressed in white and accented with a flattering breeze wherever she goes, even if everyone else exists in a windless landscape. Auntie, on the other hand, represents the undesirable woman, one who's old, alone, and bitter. Regardless of what side of the spectrum they're on, these women have duties to fulfill. Even though Auntie lives by herself, she's more bound by gender roles than anyone else in the film, literally becoming one with the house and, in theory, fully submitting to domestic responsibilities. Gorgeous isn't too fond of taking on either role throughout the film. Even when her stepmom attempts to pass the torch of ideal femininity, Gorgeous staunchly rejects it, hoping to cling on to her adolescence for as long as possible. She doesn't want to be a woman. She wants to be a girl. Unfortunately for her, by the end of the film, Gorgeous is possessed by Auntie, who dresses her in a wedding gown and compels her to take on a maternal role with her peers. Despite her initial resistance, Gorgeous was forced to submit to traditional gender roles, and worst of all, she was made to do so by a woman she trusted. It's compelling to see how Gorgeous embodies both sides of the Japanese generational divide. Once a naive girl sheltered from the world's horrors, much like 11-year-old Chigumi Obayashi, she gradually transforms into someone whose childhood is stolen, losing her closest friends and becoming witness to death and destruction, paralleling the experience of Nobuhiko Obayashi himself. Upon its creation and release, House was catered toward a younger audience, magnified by its childlike editing, plot, and main cast. However, the film went on to resonate with adolescents and adults who, if they were 7 when Hiroshima happened, were 32 when the film came out, likely new or soon-to-be parents. With all that being said, yes, House is bizarre. It's confusing and overwhelming, but I wouldn't change a thing about it. Not only is it a fun watch, it came out at a perfect time, with a seemingly subtle yet powerful goal of bridging the generational divide in Japan. Through a nonsensical portrayal of the harmful effects of generational trauma, the film seems to encourage both sides of the divide to approach relationships with one another with empathy, not ignorance or envy. At the end of the day, those to blame for war aren't the ones suffering its devastating consequences. In my interpretation of the film, I see it as a promotion of compassion and understanding, highlighting that these are the keys to healing the wounds of the past, even if that sounds incredibly sappy.
見せられましたね